go ahead and just put that in the chat. The link should be such that everyone who has the link can view it. And if you don't have it in front of you, hopefully this makes that feasible. So
is that better? Sorry.
Is that I had a hard time signing in, and as a result, I had 3 of them open. So I think I was in 3 meetings at once, but now I'm good, I think, for now.
Excellent. Great. Glad to have you back, Ruth. So I just said I put the agenda in the chat. I don't know if you can see that. There are only 3 items on the agenda, but that's partly because I expect that there'll be a lot of discussion on items 2 and 3. So I wanted to leave plenty of time for that. We'll start with just a quick look at our work plan. Specifically, rows 20 to 27, I think, are the ones of most interest right now. Then we'll talk about the advisory committee application, because we'd like to have that go at our public meeting next week. See if there's any feedback. I did not receive any feedback from board members after our working session. John Paul had put that in our to-do list, but I had not received any. I don't know if the staff received any. But other than what we discussed at the working session, I haven't gotten any other feedback. So we'll talk about that. I specifically want to spend time on how we will make sure we get the application out widely to solicit a broad pool of applicants so that we have the best possible group from which to select our advisors. And then once we're finished with that discussion, we can spend a little time on the very drafty for the advisory committee, which takes the steps from the work plan and tries to break them out over the 6 months of meetings we have between launching the advisory committee and when we've committed to getting OSCE the guiding principles for writing the standards. Right now, this is a really drafty draft. I expect this will be the first of multiple conversations we'll have between now and July about what the advisory committee will do and when it will do it. I imagine it will also be iterated upon once we convene the committee and folks begin sharing ideas or asking questions. We may have to add agenda items or move things around, but I would like us to get sort of a sketched out plan of what we expect to be doing for those 6 months with folks. Is there anything else people would like to add to the agenda?
We will application for a moment.
Yeah, that's our first big discussion.
Jessica, is there any follow-up that needs to happen coming out of the public meeting discussion with the students?
I don't think so. I mean, I know we've talked a number of times about putting something up on the board's blog. I certainly think that writing a piece for the blog might make sense to sort of consolidate all that we heard and share that out so that we can refer people to here's what we heard from students. But I don't have any other particular ideas on that. I would love if my colleagues do, though.
This is about whether to follow up with the students who testified.
Well, any follow up from that meeting, like if there's anything else we got to do with it.
I like the idea of a blog. I be a way to link some of the student testimony. I don't know if it's possible to splice it together.
I like that idea, Zachary. I don't know about that either. I think that's something we can ask the staff if it's possible to splice together any clips from the video. But I do love the idea of also sharing it in our newsletters and finding ways to share out the testimony of students. I love that the deputy mayor was able to be there while the students were testifying, because you could see the look on Paul Kine's face that, you know, we're pretty lucky to hear these students speak all the time with and sort of displaying their brilliance on the regular. but it was clear that he was really moved by the way they were suggesting we approach the standards, by the very concrete suggestions they had on what this might look like for differences in teaching. So I think the more we can share that with the public in DC, the better. Ruth, you're on mute.
I have a suggestion. So John Paul, starting last week, is putting out these regular weekly, here's what we need to do things, which I think a number of us have found super helpful. And I think since people are looking at them, one thing we could add to that would be a sort of a set of links or things that could go in the newsletters. So for example, if we had those videos or the testimonies or something, it could just be in that email so that as we all go back to do our newsletters, we can easily pull it out. And I think that would really help us get it around.
Sounds good. All right. Let's take a look then at the work plan. It's the link, the first link in the agenda. Ruth, are you able to access it? Because if you're not, I will go ahead.
No, I can. And I now have a big screen like all you important people who.
I mean, I just have my.
That's why I'm looking over there. I have like multiple things going on. It's very exciting, but it'll all probably crash. So.
Okay. So what I wanted to draw folks' attention to on the work plan, you'll see our months now start with April 2020, just for folks who don't spend a lot of time in Google Sheets. If you look up at the very top in the lettered column headings, you'll see that column C is the status, and then it goes to column O for April. If you ever wanted to see all the things we did before, you can click on those two little black arrows at the top and it will expand out all of the columns that are between C and O. Those are just hidden right now so that we can more easily see where the time period we're talking about. But because we're now just halfway into May, I left April so we can see what was most recent, and then we can see what's coming next. So rows 20 to 27 are all about the advisory group creation. We have completed our discussion of the characteristics we're looking for. We met with us to discuss the committee. We designed an application, and we're now in the point of designing a schedule of meetings and likely topics, and then soliciting the advisory committee members. And then we'll move to selecting those committee members. And I should remove this little X in May because we'll be doing that in June once all the applications are in. And then we're hoping to start those advisory committee meetings in July. And you'll note the note that, you know, per public health advisories, it is quite likely that the first meeting at least will be virtual, but that we're still hoping to have that in July. When we talk about the syllabus, as I'm calling it, I took the ideas for the syllabus from rows 28, basically down to 37, so that we knew all of those are sort of the gateways we agreed to in our discussions with OSSI. And I wanted to make sure we hit all of those as part of the advisory committee. This is not the limit of what the advisory committee will make sure that we check all those boxes along the way. Ruth, I know we've talked a lot about public input opportunities. If you scroll down, rows 45 to 49, focus on those. We completed hearing from students at the April meeting. We still are talking about ward level outreach meetings. And I think those are, you know, likely to come in the months ahead, perhaps in conjunction with our advisory board. Maybe they'll have questions they want us to ask, and we can use those as a coordinating mechanism. So any questions on the work plan? I just find it's helpful to keep track of where we are and where we said to people we were going. But if there's anything you think is missing or needs to be added, I'm certainly happy to do that.
Stay off mute. This looks good. And this is helpful to just keep coming back to just see what we've accomplished.
Yeah, and I think as we get into the advisory group, we'll keep adding things. We'll add in more specifics here on dates of meetings, topics of those meetings, because it is a public document. It means that anyone who wants to see this can come in, take a look at it, and see what's planned and for when. All right, so with that, let's go to the application itself. Talk about the application and how to get it out so that we can recruit a good group of advisors. First, let's talk about the application itself. Are there any additional thoughts from members of the committee on the application content? What's missing? What you see? Ruth, I think that's a hand.
Yes, is this the time to talk to answer that? The one thing that struck me was either in the application, I think it should be in the application, it could also be in the promotional materials, is that we should highlight the topics that we as a board are particularly interested in addressing. This goes back to an early conversation. We can't limit it, but I think we do want to say, look, we've talked about it, and here's, I think we have 4 or 5 things, so that as the applications are out there, it's attracting people who have an interest and knowledge base in those things.
So I see that. I see the idea of that. One question I have is, I'm trying to think of how best to put this. Would that potentially limit folks who have other ideas?
Well, I don't think it should, depending on how we say it. I mean, I think we should say that we're open, and in particular, people who are interested in the following, or we could just say, look, these are the things that we have identified as worthy of consideration, but we welcome anyone to apply. And I think it's how we say it. I don't think it will limit people, but I'm afraid, but I want to encourage people.
Other thoughts on that from staff or from you, Zachary? Oh, Karen's joined us too. Or Karen.
Ruth, to make sure I'm clear, so for instance, making clear our goal of ensuring that the standards are representative of diverse student populations and tells like a wider story. I'm not articulating that the way we.
Yeah, no, it was, we adopted it in July, and one of it was the diversity, one of them was the early grades content, one of them was democratic principles, civic participation. I don't remember what else there was. But as I recall, there were 4 or 5 different things. And I think we want to make sure people are aware of all of them.
In theory, this group would be responsible for upholding those principles, if I'm understanding correctly. So I think it's an interesting proposal. I don't think it would hurt. I would imagine it could detract folk who may not necessarily agree with them, but the principles, if I recall what they are, and I'm having an issue opening these documents, I'm getting a spinning wheel on my side. I don't think any of them are super controversial to the point it's like folks should have a violent reaction to it. So yeah, I wouldn't be opposed to it.
Thanks, Zachary. John Paul, do you see any issues with putting that in the text?
No, I mean, we've already approved that language, right? So I don't think it would be necessarily a limiting factor.
Okay. So then, Ruth, the suggestion is that we would take the language from the resolution and put it, say, in this first paragraph. The purpose of the advisory committee is to review the existing social studies standards. Maybe we can put in as a second sentence, the state board adopted a resolution noting an interest in the following areas, and then ending with the advisory committee will help articulate values and essential principles.
Sure.
That sounds good.
Yeah, and I think we can even link to the resolution itself in that text. That way people can pull up the full resolution and see it.
Great. I like that idea then.
Thanks. I just think it'll help us get frankly, a broader group, not a narrow group, but we'll see.
Great. Other suggestions on the application content itself?
you mean by content? I mean, what are you asking for?
So we have a draft application that the staff and I created based on the characteristics we talked about. And we shared it with folks at the working session, Karen, and then we asked people to send feedback. I didn't get any additional feedback. So Ruth just made one piece. I'm wondering if there's any others.
I mean, I didn't see anything that I would like to add. I thought it was a good document.
Thanks, Karen. All right, so that I think means that we have an application. Once that piece of our resolution is added in with a link so that folks can review the resolution itself, that is ready to go. And the plan is to release it next Wednesday in conjunction with our public meeting. What I'd love to get, the big questions I have are, one, what does that actually look like? Will there just be like a point in the agenda in which we announce that this is now public and that we let the public know where to find it? I presume we'll put it in our meeting materials. So I'd love to just get a sense of like what it actually looks like to announce this at next Wednesday's meeting. And then second, how do we want to disseminate it to make sure we get it out to the broadest audience possible? Who should we be enlisting in this? What can individual members do? What would we like staff help with, etc. So on the first, Ruth, I'd love to know from you, because I know you all are working on the agenda for next week. What does this look like to you to launch this at the public meeting?
I mean, typically, we have not really figured out a way to have sort of parts of the meeting that sort of pop out as like for special attention. So unless someone has a better idea, which I'm totally up for, I think it would be part of, what would you say, John Paul, at the early part as part of a report, or when it comes later as part of the sort of business?
I think it's kind of 6 of one, half dozen of the other. It depends on how you want to handle it. If you wanted to give, do a sort of initial, kickoff of it early in the meeting, I think that would probably be better, so that we could start tweeting about it and social media about it, at 5:30 rather than at 8 o'clock. But what I would suggest would be maybe that during your opening comments, you can even say, and I'd like to give a few minutes to Dr. Sutter to talk about, the launch of this. We've talked about this at multiple meetings, and, Jessica can talk for 30 seconds or whatever about the application and, kind of what we're looking for and how excited we are. We could do it like that.
That would be great. And then also one thing we can do is take advantage of the fact that we're on WebEx and maybe put up a copy of the application, or put up a copy of show the old standards, put up the application, sort of give the address so it's all right there.
Yeah, and we can do that same thing. We can even put the link into the YouTube chat so that people that are watching the chat can go immediately there.
Great.
Cool.
Is it?
That's also at that time I can, as part of introducing it, I can say something about the resolution and the breadth of it, and then Jessica can go from there.
I like that idea.
Is this something that we would need to vote on, or is it just more so launching it?
I think it's just launching it.
It's all approved, and
We've gone through all the steps with the board. I think what we will talk about is when we get applications back in, the process of deciding on the advisors. I think we do need to outline a little bit what that looks like, because I imagine we'll start with members of the committee reviewing the applicant pool, but then want to get input from the full board.
Got it. To the board staff, I'm not sure who was responsible for like the really cool graphics for the teacher retention report. But if it is possible to build out either one or more graphics that could accompany the application, I just think that might grab more people's attention than just launching the application itself.
So the staff is working on a lot of audio visuals already for this public meeting. So if we can, we will. But I can't. can't necessarily promise anything because there are some other things that are sort of more paramount than this for graphics.
Totally fair. What would be super helpful, John Paul, and you let me know if you would like to communicate this with Malayo or if you'd like me to, it would be helpful to make sure that at least one of the tweets in our sample tweets is about this so that we have one ready to go that folks are comfortable just copying and pasting and deploying.
Not
I
a
will say
problem.
the community school stuff is super cool. I just tweeted out that again before this meeting. And those are beautiful, beautiful graphics.
Not surprising. I'm going to just push a little bit, understanding that this is a significant body of work for the board. I think it would be a missed opportunity if we didn't have any graphic representation to go along with it. And I know it may seem minor, but either Twitter or Facebook or newsletters from board members, I just find that we should represent this the same way we are representing the events that's happening tomorrow and the teacher retention work. So I'm happy to help. I'm not great on graphics, but if it's a matter of capacity, I'm happy to lend some.
Zach, can I just say, I also appreciate what you're saying, and I'm for it, and I think the staff would like to do it, but they do have a big list of things. But what I do think is true about what you're saying is insofar as it can't become a super jazzy thing at the meeting, it can be jazzier for a follow-up so that, again, it goes in this sort of collection of here's what you can put in your newsletter, and that could have a graphic. And that subsequent to the actual night, the sky is more the limit.
This might be an unpopular opinion. I would say, well, then let's entertain delaying the launch. I see this launch of this application as like a very front-facing thing, like a report would be, and will certainly attract more people. I'm thinking if there's graphics. I'm not trying to be a pain here, but and I think that could look. I don't think it needs to be detailed to be clear or 10 different slides, but something to go along with the application.
Let me circle with the staff after this meeting, and we'll see what we think we can come up with. I mean, I just want to make sure that we actually can do it right. I don't want it to be, slap shot. So let me circle with the staff after this meeting, and then we'll work on it.
Shocking to no one, I'm going to advocate a middle path and suggest that we don't delay the launch, mostly because when we get into our next conversation, you'll see the timeline we're working on. And I do want to make sure we have adequate time for the application to be open before we have to select and then convene. But I would also think that we could, there are soft openings of restaurants when we get all the kinks out. So we invite people to come taste the food, but we don't expect the full experience. Like we launch the application at the meeting, and then the following Monday, we do some jazzy, promos on social media when staff has had a chance to regroup and get to the next set of items on their to-do list. So I'll look forward to John Paul afterwards. Once he's had a chance to connect with the team.
Yeah, and let me just say, partly it's we just have a lot of things right now, and which is great. And I agree with both of those things. And possibly for the staff, it's a calendar of sort of when we're going to be promoting different things. As we've got the community schools coming up, we've got this coming up, we've got the May meeting on the STAR framework review. We're still pushing the retention report. We're going to have the retention resolution, all of which is good. But it feels like, and to Jessica's point, it feels like we now really need a schedule that sort of shows how we're pushing each of these out over a period of time.
Yeah, totally.
Hi, it's Malayo. I'd like to say something, if you don't mind.
Of course.
Hi, Malayo.
Hi. So I was listening in, and definitely, we do our best to make sure we, make the graphics and make the social media, more attractive to our users. I also think it's important to note that it's more impactful when the actual board members retweet what we do. A lot of times it just sits on our page and other organizations will retweet it or like it. But I think every board member should, make it a point of duty to actually spread the word on their individual accounts.
Point. I think that's really important. Especially, I'll note, we've got some board members with significant social media followings. And I think it is really impressive when folks tweet stuff out and you watch it sort of rise up. I know that's true for Zachary. It's certainly true for Marcus. I am in awe of their social media skills.
Jessica.
I've got plenty of followers. I won't say I get a ton of retweets, but I'm working on it. I'm studying at the feet of the masters and figuring this out as I go. Yeah, so I think that's great. I am very excited to launch this. Let's talk about how we actually get this out there, because I think we'll all be ready to put it up on Twitter.
Jessica, 1 second, just because I don't know if Malaya was here at the very beginning. Malaya, one of the things that we talked about was including in this email that John Paul was starting to send out weekly, a list of the tweets and stuff that people can tweet out and put into the newsletter. So it'll be in one place, and hopefully we can all become more automatic about it. So recognize it as an issue.
Sure, yeah, that
Yeah,
makes sense.
I know I find the full tweets really helpful.
I'm just going to jump in. I don't tweet, but I just took some tweeting lessons, and I'll jump in soon too.
Tweeting.
I love it, Karen. I love it.
I want to hear more.
Well, I haven't done it yet. I'm taking lessons. I just said that, right?
Well, I was more interested with the lessons, but we'll connect offline. That's really cool.
Okay, yeah, all right.
Okay, so let's talk about how we're going to get the word out, because to the point of tweeting, I think putting the application on Twitter will hit a certain market of folks who we want to attract to apply to this and to their networks. But I do not think it will hit the entirety of folks that we want to make sure see this application. So what other ways can we use our networks? So to Ruth's point, I would hope that we can put together some sample language so that every single board member can put this out in their newsletter. I would also hope that we can share it with school leaders in our wards, whether they're on your newsletter list or you send them separate emails, to make sure that we're also attracting the possibility of school leader and teacher applicants. Scott Abbott reached out to me, and I just sent him an email with the latest update on where the committee was in their work, let him know this application was coming out, that we would connect with him and ask him to spread this through his network. I was also thinking that we've got a ton of university connected folks on the board between Emily at Georgetown, me at American, my grad school connections at Maryland, Fraser's connections at UDC, Ruth's connections at GW. We want to make sure we work all of those and get out to the network of folks in the universities. I don't have a ton of connections at Howard. I want to make sure we get this to the faculty at Howard, so if folks have those connections. I also want to make sure we get it to folks at Trinity, because a lot of our students in DC PS end up at Trinity, and we want to make sure that folks there are looped into this. They do a ton of teacher prep work. I'd also like to make sure we get it to some of the alt-cert programs so that we get this to urban teachers, and I'm glad Dr. Simmons will be with us next week. I'm sure he'd be a good connection for that, as well as to Capital Teacher Residency and Teach for America, to make sure that we're getting this to their networks as well. So feeling good about emailing, tweeting. How else can we get this out to people?
I just say, I think we should all do that. I also think the board is putting together, the staff is putting together, I think, a list to send the retention report to that will be all principals, all deans. So I think that'll be a good list also, and it can come from the board as well. Does that work?
Yeah, so is that like that's going to be like an email distribution list, John Paul?
Yeah. All right.
Yeah, I support. I really like that idea of like disseminating it in a central place and then allowing board members to kind of follow up in their own channels. Ruth, do you have an idea when that might be available to send like that type of message?
I mean, I think it's imminent. Am I right, John Paul?
Yeah, we're pretty close.
My type A self would like very much to make a list of all the people we want to send it to. And I'm gonna take that on. I'll make an Excel list of just like the categories of people we want to make sure we get it to. And then perhaps I can share that with John Paul and the staff, just see who's already going to be on that teacher distribution list. And then I can put a column for any other individuals on the board. We may need to reach out to other specific folks. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think you should send it to all of us, just the list, Jessica, so we can also add categories.
Yeah.
Anyway.
No, that's exactly right. That's what I'll do. I'll make another Google spreadsheet so that everyone can access it, and I'll make it accessible so that board members can add categories, names.
I don't know what capabilities the state board's newsletter has. I think that's through MailChimp, but is it possible to send like, no, it's not. Okay. Well, I know like, for instance, in MailChimp, I can track how many people received it, how many people opened it, which people opened it. And so versus sending it via just like a blanketed email that goes into the list, if we could send it through like some type of tracking platform, could allow us to do some targeted outreach.
We use Granicus. And so some of that tracking is available, but it's the analytics aren't as easy to use as in some places. But I can circle back with Malayo too and figure out exactly the right folks to do that. The distribution lists that we have are sort of not as sorted as would be useful in this instance, I think.
I have one comment, and this is slightly to Darren's point in the chat. I think we had a discussion early on about, making sure that the list also goes to probably national organizations as well, and individuals who have had experience potentially with revision of standards of other states or in those spaces. And so I think we should be thinking about organizations like one that Darren mentioned, the National Council for Social Studies, which is based locally, but other social studies and civics organizations that have a national presence but based in the district.
Yep, I think that's a great idea, Alex. I'll make sure to add in a couple of those on the spreadsheet as a starter, and then encourage other folks to add in. I will make that spreadsheet today so that goes out to folks, and then we can talk about it back and forth over email, just so that we can keep track on that of like who's sent something out, who's done the outreach to those groups, so that we can track that getting out. We talked about launching the application on the 20th, just to bring everyone's attention to it. On the application itself, the application is due on June 12th. So that's the window of time. And while we'll want to make sure that we get the application out as early as possible to people, certainly if folks think of people next week, they're like, oh, we launched the application, we sent out some of these emails, but I've got 3 new ideas. We can keep rolling out the application, I would say, until that week that it is due, so that we can make sure for maximum dissemination.
So Jessica, what about you talked about the national groups, but also we have so many local social studies groups. Would that be part of what you would also include?
Yeah, tell me who you're thinking of when you say that, Ruth, just so I can distinguish between like.
Well, I mean, MICVA, the group with the mural in Capitol Hill.
Power. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the writing group that One World, the ones that come to mind, but I know there's a lot of them. The Bill of Rights group. I don't know who else is here in DC. But if you start that just with what you know, again, we can just all sort of chime in. And then the other thing I would say, are we on the same track on this, is that ideally then each of these becomes part of the board, the central board mailing list. So it's going out from the central board, but we're punctuating and pushing it out extra as members.
Yes. So here's what I don't want to do though. And I don't, I hear what you're saying about punctuating it. I don't know if everybody else has experienced this, but my email inbox has been flooded during this coronavirus time with extra emails from people wanting to just make sure that I saw their first 14 emails on a topic. And it is really overwhelming. I'm finding myself with a lot higher email volume than before this. And so what I don't want to do is turn people off to our application by having them receive it from a distribution list and then also get a note from Ruth and then also get a note from Jessica. So in some ways, I do want to make sure we divide and conquer.
Well, I will defer, but I guess what I'm thinking is, to the extent that I would, for the most part, I think as members, we would be promoting it more in Twitter and in newsletters and not as a separate batch of emails. And what I'm concerned about is every time we try to do this divide and conquer and everybody's doing a piece of it, it's really, really hard to coordinate. And I just think having a central list, and I will defer to you, Jessica, if you really don't want it, but I think if we can have a central list and know that it's all going out centrally, on top of which at appropriate points we're tweeting, or if we have a personal contact. But I'm otherwise just afraid things are going to fall through and people get busy and it doesn't happen and blah, blah.
Yeah, I certainly don't mind. I think absolutely everyone should be tweeting and everyone should put it in their newsletter, and that is fine as an additional layer of contact. But I am thinking, like, if I'm Mikva or I'm One World, it certainly makes sense that they'd be on the state board distribution list. But they've been very good to us. They've been very generous with helping their students prepare and partnering with us, that it almost feels like they should get a note from us. That's like, we want to make sure you've seen this application and are planning to consider applying, rather than it just being the mass email. Do you know what I mean?
Yep. And I think, Ruth, I'm not sure if what I'm hearing it from you is like a reminder, yes, to the layers, but I could see a world where it goes out the day that this launches. And then if it's going to close on June 12th, did you say? Maybe we set a date where there's going to be a final reminder before the end date to ensure that we kind of close the loop on folks. Is that what you meant by, or did you mean like Jessica sends out a original blast, then you follow up on your own mailing list with those same folks?
I'm saying, I think we talked about that there should be a central email from the board to the principals, and we made that list, that should be a full list. They should get one email from the central board. And then in addition, each of us, insofar as we have newsletters, we put it in the newsletter, we tweet it. And insofar as we have personal contacts with particular groups, we would send follow-up letters. That would be that's how I would do it. But I don't want to interfere with Jessica's idea of doing it, but that's how I would do it. I'm afraid that that's how I would do it.
I think we're in agreement then, because what I am hearing is that there will be essential communication, and then we will layer on top of that via newsletters and social media. That's right.
Yeah, I think that's fine. I think I have a particular bias on the fact that I ignore a lot of generic mail blast emails because there's too much email in my life.
Yeah.
So I would be inclined to ignore a mailing blast from an org like State Board. Not that I don't love the State Board, but I would be inclined to ignore that email, where I would not ignore a direct communication from my ward member in the same way. So I'm fine with it being part of a generic email from the State Board, but I do think if there are specific groups we want to make sure we target, I think there we should divide and conquer to make sure that people we really want to pay attention and apply get a personal message.
So, I mean, I think then we all agree there should be a centralized to this whole list, and there should be a follow-up or divide and conquer, whatever, however you want to put it. And then if you don't want that to just be everybody to their own people, Jessica, are you going to organize sort of a divide and conquer on it?
Yes, and I'm going to use that same Excel spreadsheet for that, so that there'll be here's everyone we want to make sure is covered. Here's who's going to take charge of that direct contact. So I will take on that. Okay. Anything else on the application distribution and getting applicants back?
Just another category, and we can do this more on the spreadsheet, but I think people should think about sort of other civic oriented groups. Like, we've talked before about some of the museums. Where else? I mean, unlike some of the other subjects, there really are a lot of places that are interested in this, and we don't need to take time now, but as people look at the spreadsheet, sort of think of some other places that we could reach out to.
I think your point on museums is a good one. Like museum curators, right?
Yeah. Or their ed programs, actually, is probably what I would do.
Like the folks at the Anacostia Museum pop out to me
Yes,
immediately.
exactly, exactly. And I know a lot of them have education coordinators. The Holocaust Museum does, the African American Museum does, oh, you know, so there's just, and that's what they do. So they'd be.
Yep. Okay. I didn't put it on this specifically because I know there's a lot of opinions on it, and I think I'd rather start with a couple of emails between us before we have space for discussion. The next thing I think that comes on this advisory committee discussion, besides what we want the group to do when they are together, is how we will select from the pool of applicants. So we've talked about the characteristics we're looking for. We've asked people to respond to that in the applications. But we haven't talked about the process of selecting. So I will send an email to the committee. I will commit to sending that out to talk a little bit about like, what are your thoughts on how we design a process for selection? Because I have an idea in my head, but my hunch is that we all have ideas in our head. And I'd love to sort of crowdsource that first and then put together an agenda for our next meeting to discuss that selection process. Just so that we're clear on calendaring, and this is just a sort of fluke of time that I can't really get around. Our next committee meeting is on June 10th, before the applications are due. So I'd like to dedicate the bulk of that committee meeting to discussing the selection process. By then we'll have a sense of the size of the applicant pool and maybe a little bit about characteristics of who's applied. But I'd love to discuss in detail the selection process on June 10th. And then we'll have the application close on the 12th and we'll orchestrate the process for selection. Does that make sense?
Yeah, quick question, Jessica. How much do you anticipate though that folks who apply would be curious about the process, and like what questions we would be able to answer ahead of time, you know, about how the selection process will be conducted? I assume it won't be a large swath of people who apply who will be like, who's reviewing it, and like, but maybe, you know.
Yeah. So I defer to folks who've worked on these processes before. How much of that did you share up front on the selection committee, the selection process for the ESSA task force or for the grad requirements task force?
Yeah, I have a narrow memory, and probably John Paul can fill in a little bit of the gaps, but I think we had a pretty clear process outlined from beginning to end from the start, which was, you know, which was, I guess, helpful. But I feel like we had a pretty clear picture of what the selection process is going to look like from beginning to end, I think, before we started. I don't know how many people asked about it ahead of time, but I know we were pretty intentional about trying to lay it out as kind of transparently as possible ahead of time.
And what did that look like? Like, was it a screen to make sure you had folks who, because I know Jack mentioned this in our working session, that there were some concerns over categories and quotas that we have not established for this committee intentionally. So we don't have those, which means we can't be transparent about them because we don't have them. But like, besides that, besides committing to including parents, teachers, students, former students from charters, from DCPS, from each of the 8 wards, what other characteristics did you use for selection or non-selection?
John Paul, I'm going to try to look up and dig up some stuff and send it over to you, Jessica. I'm sure I've got some stuff, but John Paul, if you have anything.
So, I mean, ESSA was a little bit different than the high school task force, right? So ESSA had specific categories that we were looking for, sort of representatives of these types of categories. For high school grad, it was much broader. There was the larger category of sort of, you know, we wanted more than 50% of the folks to be working or living in wards 5, 7, and 8, which I think is still, you know, a valid thing. But I think for this one, I would say, I think one of the problems that we had with ESSA was that by saying particular categories of people, we had some people that we had to say no to that would have been great, but we didn't have a slot for them. And then we had other that we had slots, but no people for them. I mean, so we had to sort of go actively out to solicit people for that type of role. And so, I mean, I think it's, you know, it's just a balancing act. I think my preference would probably be to see what we get. And then if there are any holes that we identify as saying like, oh, you know what, we really need a X type of person to represent this type of really important group, then we can add someone on the back end. And I think that's fine.
Okay. So I'll draw folks' attention back to the fact that on the application itself, we say, the selection committee will strive to ensure membership is representative of the backgrounds of the students and families in the district. Members will be selected on the following criteria. And then we have 3 categories of criteria: experience, representative sort of nature of the person, and their commitment, the ability to attend 80% of the meetings, to do the work ahead of time, to engage in community outreach, which are sort of check boxes at the end of the application. So my gut is that we will see how many applications we get. There'll be a basic screening that I would love to solicit the staff's help with, and if that's not possible, solicit the committee's help with, which is sorting into some of these categories. So folks who are willing to make the commitment as the first screen, because that is a clear thing that we're expecting of people. Second, making sure we have categories representative of the folks we want on board. We want to make sure we have representation, folks demographically, that represent students and families in the district. We want to make sure we've got some teachers. We want to make sure we've got some LEA leaders. We want to make sure we've got institutions of higher ed folks. So making sure we've got some representative categories, and then drilling down into experience. So once we have the set of folks who are committed and we look at the demographics to make sure they're representative across the categories we're looking for, to make selections based on that experience. So if we've got a committed person who is racially, ethnically representative of a category we care about, but has no experience, and we have the same kind of person who has experience, we would defer to the experience. Does that make sense?
Yep.
I don't know that I want to say more about the selection criteria, but if others feel differently that we need to go further, let's by all means talk about that.
I would say I would agree with not sharing more upfront. I thought, Marcus, that was a great question, and it could just be something that we share that we'll put out at a later date. Which brought up the question for me: do we have a deadline for when we want to share news with applicants about their application? And then a second thought was, I think we've done a great job of anchoring around student voice in this process so far. I would strongly recommend that we include student voice somewhere in the process of selecting members of this advisory panel. 2 ideas there could be incorporating our student advisory committee, and somehow, I don't know what that looks like, but including them somehow, or our 2 student members, inviting them to our next committee meeting when we talk about it, just to make sure that we're keeping true to that spirit.
Yep, I like that point a lot, Zachary. I think one thing we did talk about, and that has been done in the past, is we make public the list of all applied, as well as those who are selected. And I think that makes really good sense, so that folks also get a sense of, we had 200 applicants and we selected 19 people, or we had 50 applicants and we selected 19 people, so that folks can see sort of what the pool and the selected down group is. As for when we've committed to it, we have said that we're going to convene the group on July 7th. So if that's the case, we have between June 12th and the weekend before to do this. It's not a ton of time. It's about 2 weeks. And will require likely an ad hoc scheduling of a social studies committee conversation so that we can do that.
Oh, Jessica?
Yeah.
Just a quick question. How long do you expect this task force or committee to last? Because that's going to be an essential question when people are applying or not applying. So I don't know if we figured that out yet, but that should be part of the process up front to let people know the term of their enact, you know. So.
No, it's a great question, Karen. On the application itself, we do say the advisory committee is a multi-year commitment and will run through at least fall 2021. The next item on our agenda, and I do know John Paul is going to leave us here in a second, but the next item on our agenda is the draft advisory plan syllabus. And if you look at that document, you'll see that we've sort of sketched out as a very drafty draft, meetings through the month of December, because the plan in our work plan is that we convene in July and we hand OSSI a set of principles by the end of 2020 so that they are ready to begin assembling a writing task force at the beginning of 2021. So it's 6 months of deeply engaged work, followed by sort of a fallow period, I would call it, when we will likely not need to engage this committee very often. And then when OSSI brings back their draft of the standards, we've left it to the advisory committee and the board to jointly take a look and say, did the standards meet the guiding principles that the advisory committee offered and the board voted on? And while the board could certainly decide that on its own, I think it's a better public process to re-engage this advisory committee who said, here's what we think the guiding principles are, to review the revised standards and say, yeah, we concur that these meet the principles, or we don't think these meet the guiding principles. So we do tell them through fall 2021, but I think the most intense work is going to be expected from July through December.
Okay.
And Jessica, is it safe to assume that our committee is going to essentially just roll into these advisory panel meetings?
So we talked about that as well. I don't think it's fair to assume that all of us will be part of this panel in the same way. We discussed Ruth and I acting as co-chairs of this, both.
No, I wasn't a co-chair. I was just there. I think the co-chair, we can talk about that later, but that's not what I understood, nor do I think that.
Let me go back to this because I do want to be clear on this because we did talk about it at length and I don't want to miss how we discussed it. Give me 1 second to see if I can pull up the right notes on that.
Regardless of the titles, it seems like perhaps you and Ruth would be a part of the panel and that your work there we would still have regular committee meetings and you all would be coming back to report out what's happening with the panel.
That's right. So we did talk about the fact that if we're looking to have 15 to 19 people, now obviously some of the concerns that we discussed having to do with like physical limitations of rooms may not be an issue if we're talking about virtual settings, but still having a ton of people in a virtual room does get complicated. We talked, Ruth and I attend the meetings, having us play facilitative roles and, you know, deep listening, observing roles, not voting as far as the committee might decide to vote on things, but rather to facilitate, guide the conversation, bring feedback back to the board, bring questions from the board to the committee to make sure that there's a clear line of communication between the two.
I would just add to this, and I don't want to revisit what we visited, but I think it's insofar as other committee members want to be part of it, that part of what we had said was that they could, not talk, but be there, be at the meetings. And so
I think what we discussed, Ruth, was we talked about the possibility of having people say like, I'd like to attend for this topic, but I think this is where we got into a rather in-depth conversation around how crowded that might make the room feel if we were in a physical place, / how that might appear to members of the advisory committee if there were a lot of board members in the room for discussions that, you know, led it to be sort of 19 people in total, which already included the 2 board members, which already included a representative from OSSI, but now also had 4 or 5 other board members in the room.
My understanding was that we said they weren't going to talk, but they could come. So, well, if that's not what you captured, so
I
be it.
apologize. I'm not able to find the note document while I'm.
I don't want to belabor it. I don't want to belabor it. We can, if you find your notes, you can talk about it, or it's done. I don't want
I'd
people to
love
feel
to-
left out, but we can.
Alex, you were part of this conversation as well. Am I misremembering what we discussed?
To be completely honest, Jessica, I was not there for part of that conversation. I'm reviewing the notes though and trying to get a better sense. Not to put Sarah or Caitlin on the spot, if they're remembering. But based on the notes that I am reviewing right now, it does appear that you all agreed that board members would help facilitate the meetings. I think Marcus had, made a comment about previous task forces, but that board members would not contribute to the work. Dr. Sutter, Jessica, you reiterated that we should not be interfering with the panel's work. I think Zachary had suggested that, let's see here, or maybe it was Marcus. Marcus had suggested that the panel hold a brief meeting for the whole board before they vote to adopt any recommendations as a way to convene the full board. But those are kind of some high level things that I'm quickly finding in my skim of my notes. And so again, not to put Sarah or Caitlin on the spot and not to belabor this, to Ruth's point.
So I think, yeah, I think I got the answer to my question. In the spirit of those notes, it seems like we want to ensure that the panel is able to conduct their business without significant interference and opinion from board members or even committee members, which seems right.
Yeah, and to your point, Zachary, we absolutely will continue our committee meetings, because I do think that there will be things that Ruth and I will bring back to say, the panel discussed X, Y, Z. You all have opinions on this? Do you have questions about that? Do you have suggestions for experts we might bring to the room? Are there ways you'd like us to ask questions of the panel? So I don't think the effort here is to shut out opportunities for members to provide feedback. I think it's about orchestrating that in such a way that lets the panel do its work without feeling watched over the shoulder by, half our board. There's only 9 members, so 2 of us will be in the room already. If we then invite three more, it's more than half the board physically in the room, or in the virtual room. And I think that's my concern.
And I'll also add this too. With the ESSA task force, the state board did a really good job of this, and I imagine the hope will be for the social studies advisory committee too. But all of the meetings were live streamed. And so, whether we're in a situation where this is a virtual meeting or not, I do imagine we will live streaming these meetings to some extent. And that is a perfectly okay opportunity for board members to tune in and watch via that live stream without physically being there, to Jessica's point of, this appearance of hovering or anything like that.
Okay. Well, with you, Ruth?
Yeah, like I said, I did not mean to belabor it. It's trying to find the right mix here, and I'm satisfied with what we have. I would hope that we might also revisit it at some point, but I'm fine.
I'd like us not to revisit it, so I'd like to get to a point where we have an agreement on it, because
no, I'm agreed on it. All I'm saying is we may be virtual, we may be live, and it may work well and it may not. That's all I'm saying. I'm fine with it. I'm in a slightly different place on a continuum, but not far, and it's fine. What you've described is fine.
Okay. I will be I'm totally transparent. This kind of thing really stresses me out when I feel like our committee has reached an agreement and then we get to a point of relitigating. It feels like we can't reach a consensus and say we're done and move on. It feels like everything is always open to revisiting.
To be clear, Jessica, as I said, my understanding from last time was different. I wasn't relitigating something. I was explaining my understanding of it last time. And as we saw, it was fuzzy in a number of ways. We've now clarified it. It's fine with me. I guess all I'm saying is, and if you don't want to do this, that's okay. All I'm saying is, as we go through this, there may be a desire on your part, my part, or anybody else's part to say, let's revisit it. And if you don't want, I mean, it's not a big deal. I'm just, it's, if it makes you nervous and stressed out, drop it. It's just an effort to be open. Anyway, it's fine.
Okay, so my understanding then, for the record, as it were, is that we have an assembled group of advisors. We're going to use the criteria described in the application to select them. We have a 2-week period between June 12th and the end of the month to select those folks so that we can convene a group of advisors on July 7th. To Zachary's point, which I think is a really good one, he suggested we find a way to incorporate student voice in that selection. I do think working with our student reps and seeking their input on the best way to do that, whether that's their input alone or other members of the advisory committee, the student advisory committee, seems the right way to go on that. We'll select those folks, and then Ruth and I will act in facilitative and interlocutor roles between the advisory committee, the social studies standards committee of the board, and the full board to make sure that that information flows. To Alex's point, these meetings will be streamed, whether they are in a room or a virtual space, and we'll invite all the board members to participate by watching the streaming. And then if there are specific instances when a board member says, I really want to be present for X, I do think we are open to that being the case, that we simply would not allow it to be free and open at every meeting, so that we didn't end up with a preponderance of board members in the room that might make it feel overloaded. But certainly that if Zachary said, listen, I hear we're having an expert speak on XYZ today, I'd really like to be there for that. That would be, I think, a perfectly, acceptable interest for a board member and one I'd want to honor.
Sounds good to me.
Okay. So with our last couple minutes here, let's take a look at the draft of the syllabus, just to start a conversation around how we think the boards, the advisory committee will spend its time. So I took just the steps from the work plan and outlined it here, breaking down what seemed to make sense from a goal of getting the guiding principles to OSCE on December 1st and being able to go back to the first meeting. So I should say, just for clarification's sake, when Alex and John Paul and I met to talk about the drafting of the application, we picked July 7th with the idea that we would go with the first Tuesday of the month. That would put it before every working meeting for the month, allowing us to bring anything at the working session to the board working meeting, as well as the social studies committee meeting, as well as the board full meeting before we reconvene the group again. So putting it at the front of the month gave us all that opportunity to interact with the board before the next meeting of the advisory group. Does that make sense? So that it wouldn't be retrospective, it would be forward looking. Like, advisory committee meets on July 7th. Anything they bring up could be brought to the board 3 times. Working session, committee meeting, full meeting, before the advisory group convened again. So with that in mind, we've got 6 meetings before the end of the year. The 7th of July, the 4th of August, the 1st of September, so on and so forth. So take a moment and take a look at how I broke the time and give me first thoughts. What else should we be thinking about in here? Are there timelines that you think don't make sense? I built in a little slack at the end, since we said we'd get the guiding principles by the end of the year, that if we needed to, we could use a December public meeting for that if things were not ready by the November public meeting.
So one question is, so the advisory committee comes up with something, call it X, and then X is going to get played out at board public meetings, November, December, and then Does it go back to the advisory committee, then it just goes to the board?
Then it goes to OSI.
No, at some point we're adopting it. So I'm saying between the time that there's a set of principles, there's a set of principles that comes from the advisory committee. It gets reviewed by the public. And then at some point it gets adopted by us. And then, but does it between the public and before it gets to us, does it go back to the advisory committee?
So I think so. I mean, the way I've outlined it here is that when the advisory committee first meets, we're introducing everybody, we're setting the norms for what the final product is going to be. Like, these are guiding principles, what we have in mind for guiding principles. Here are the existing standards. Start to read them. We spent August really deeply diving into what are the social studies, what questions do you have, what thoughts do you have. Perhaps we invite experts to that meeting to discuss the standards with the committee. In September, we do a more formal review with the advisory committee of the standards. What is missing? What surprised you? What should we absolutely keep? Very similar to what our committee did informally several months ago, but we do this formal process with the advisory group. October, the group is expected to start drafting some guiding principles for what the standards revision should include and how they want to engage the public. This is where I'm not so sure. We might actually have to talk about that public engagement as part of September as well, because that's a lot for one meeting. In October, the advisory group and the state board go to the public to get feedback on, here's what we thought the guiding principles might be. What do you think of this? November, the advisory committee comes back together to draft those guiding principles. Here's where the room is in the system, Ruth, to decide. If the advisory committee comes up with these recommendations, and they're ready to hand them to the board, they're like, yes, this is our best assessment of what the guiding principles should be, then we could vote on them at our meeting. If they say, we need more, that's actually not going to pass muster with our board. We know there'll be some significant questions. Here's what we think those questions might be. They could continue to use December to do that, and then we could vote at our December public meeting. But at that point, I think once we vote, the only thing left to do with the advisory committee in this phase of their work is to thank them.
Generally, this seems right, and thanks for laying this out. The two thoughts that come to mind, I completely agreed at the the August meeting, having some way of building context for researchers that may not have the same as the DMU, who may not regularly hear from students or teachers, and so incorporating that voice there for committee members. And then secondly, is there a way to build in context that we did at a high level, and I know you did, Jessica, around like how other states or localities have engaged in this process, I think will be important. Whether that's like homework that we give or if it's a discussion at a meeting.
I think that's a great point, Zachary.
And as part of that, and we've talked about it, and I think it's sort of elsewhere as well, is just to get a kind of a rundown of, in the dozen years or so since we've revised ours, what have other people done? What are sort of the big ways in which states have made big revisions? They may be ones that we like, they may not be ones that we like, but let's know what they are.
Unrelated to the syllabus, which I think largely looks good, is there going to be, and I know a lot of these questions are because I need to leave the last meeting early, like a hierarchical structure to this panel, or is it like just like a panel? Is there going to be like a point person that's going to develop agendas connected to these themes? In other words, like we're building out the syllabus. Is this going to be handed off to someone that's going to, or is this what you and Ruth are kind of co-facilitating the meetings from?
My general thinking, and I'm open to feedback on this because I may not have been clear on this, but since we will not have a staff member who can be totally dedicated to the work of standards, my thought is that the committee will establish agendas for that, like this committee, our board committee, will work to establish an agenda. We'll work with the staff to prep whatever materials are needed for that and gather whatever resources, invite experts, et cetera. And then Ruth and I will facilitate the meeting itself. And then we'll use all that to develop.
So we're doing the heavy lift. And so we would want to make sure that we're really fleshing these out.
Yeah.
Got it. Clear.
Other thoughts or feedback on what might be missing from here? I know, Ruth, you've had a lot of thoughts on inviting experts, and so I dropped in just that placeholder. But if there are specific things that come to mind, I'll change the settings on this to allow folks to have edit access. I just didn't have time to type in everyone's email last night, and I don't want this to be the general public access. So I'll get that in there for you. But if you have thoughts on specific experts that you have in mind or categories of experts you want us to be thinking about for those particular meetings, I think we're also, you know, there are opportunities to co-create some of these requests with the advisors once they're named.
So everybody will sort of offer recommendations and then we'll sort of see where it leads and we'll talk to the committee as well.
Right. My hunch is like, you know, in listening to Scott Abbott talk about experiences they have found positive at DCPS, Dr. Nell Duke, and her work specifically on rich content in the, you know, in social studies, but in general, like she has been a really driving force in DCPS's curricular work. So I would imagine if he's on the committee, he's going to suggest her. My gut is that some of the professors from the institutions of higher ed, they do totally love her over there, would have suggestions for, you know, oh, you know who would be great to speak on this, so-and-so. So I want to leave space for that, to actually leverage the advisors and their expertise. But I definitely, Justin Tooley from OSSE was saying this very clearly to John Paul and I, like, there's a real tightrope walk between allowing the input and leveraging the knowledge of the group, but also keep things tightly facilitated enough that we don't go off on too many tangents. So I think it will be up to you and I, Ruth, to really strike that balance as we seek to the expertise of our advisors, but also not let us go down too many rabbit holes.
Jessica, this is Alex, and I may have missed this because I had to step away for a second. But did you talk about how long each of these meetings would last?
We didn't. My general sense is that I don't find you get a lot of value add for meetings that go over 2 hours. So I would love to calendar them for 2 hours, with the hope of like some of them being 90 minutes and others needing to take the full 2 hours. But I worry that if we go over that, especially in a virtual environment, we're going to lose folks. To Zachary's point too, and one thing not built into this yet is I do think, and we asked this on the application, I think there'll be some homework for people, right? Like we're not going to give people time in the 2 hour meeting to read the standards. That's an expectation that they'll be given the standards and asked to read them and come to the meeting prepared with reflections. We may at the meeting say, you know, we can do a whole reading. We can break into grade level bands. We can break into content spaces, and we can figure that out as we go. Yeah, I think that's a really good commitment to keep here, Marcus, as well, to be in and out. And two, I just think, one, we're asking people to do this as a voluntary commitment, and we'll lose people's attention.
I think in the application, if it doesn't already say, but could just acknowledge that there's going to be homework, that would be probably useful, so people expected it.
I think it does. I can double check that, but
I saw it.
Yeah, I'm fairly certain it says there'll be engagement between meetings.
Yes, it does.
Okay.
All right, I want to be mindful of our time. So things I have committed to in our conversation today. We talked about follow-up from the April meeting, having some sort of a blog or text for the newsletter on the student testimony. So I'll coordinate with the staff on that. The application, we've agreed to add in notes from the state board resolution on what the state board sees as priorities in the standards revision, and we'll hyperlink that to the resolution. We'll put that in that first sort of paragraph describing the purpose of the committee. We're going to launch it at the public meeting, and you'll build into the agenda some time for Ruth to introduce it, some time for me to say something for 30 seconds to a minute. We'll put the link to the application in the chat, and we'll have some sort of material for social media promotion, whether that's a sample tweet language or something more by then. And then in order to facilitate that full distribution of the application, I am going to today create an Excel sort of Google Sheet spreadsheet with all the people I can think of that we want to make sure get this. I'll make that open source to the members of the board so that we can add in anyone that I have missed. We'll also make sure that the distribution list being created for teacher retention is used to send this out to folks. And there'll be a column in that spreadsheet to keep track of any personal follow-ups that board members are going to make to folks with whom they have personal connection. We are going to, I'm going to keep building out this draft syllabus with some specifics around homework, etc. And I do want to touch base with John Paul and the staff about exactly what we need to get ready for the July 7th meeting, which if you saw the tweet from the mayor's office come in, still in a stay-at-home order till June 8th. So I think it is 98% likely that this July meeting will be fully virtual. What exactly we need to have ready to be ready to go on that. I also am realizing we don't have a clear process lined out for how we will select the advisory members in that 2-week period between June 12th and the end of the month. We don't have any time on the calendar or whatever, so I want to dive in on that with the staff as well and make sure that I can ask for time on your calendar if we need it. Any other next steps that I've missed?
And that's going to be the focus of our next committee meeting, the selection process.
This election, yeah, which is June 10th.
All of that is pretty clear.
I don't necessarily want to say, I'm worried about the short timeline between getting the application out and getting it in. And it may just be there's not a useful, helpful way to extend it, but I wanted to raise it because it's concerning.
Yeah, I mean, if folks feel like it's too tight, we certainly could postpone launching the advisory committee until August. I don't, in a normal year, I would say no one in DC is around in August. This year, everything is normal. So I would guess most people will be here in August. I also don't, and this offends my type A sensibilities, but I have no idea how many applications we might get, right? We might get 25 applications for a board that we're saying is 15 to 19. We might get 150.
Right.
Excuse me, Jessica.
Yes, Karen.
I have to sign off. I'm sorry. I have
Okay.
another. All right. I'll call you later. Bye-bye. Bye, Ruth.
Bye, Karen. Have a good day.
Thank you.
I don't know, Alex, if you have any insights into what past selection timelines have looked like.
I was quickly talking with John Paul about this, and from my understanding, and Marcus, correct me if I'm incorrect, is for like the ESSA task force, I believe, once the applications were received, the state board staff coded them so that all identifying information was removed, created some sort of evaluation form, and members then evaluated the applications, providing a score for each. And it appears that each application was reviewed by 2 individuals, so that there's 2 different scores that could be averaged. That is my understanding of it. Again, I was not part of the staff during the application process for ESSA or for high school grad. And so Marcus, I don't know if you can speak, or even Ruth, if you can speak to having previously reviewed applications for those committees.
But also, I'm wondering about not the reviewing the application so much, but the collecting them from the date of launch to the date of closing.
So I don't know.
Is that-
So the applications are a Google form. So everyone's responses go right from the form into a spreadsheet.
No. I mean, from the moment, in other words, all the people out there who, they have now 2 weeks from the moment we have tweeted it out or announced it to the time it gets in. That's the window I'm concerned about. Is that enough time for it to be out there? That's all I'm raising. I'm not concerned on the other side.
And I think Jessica's point, and I think she made this comment during the working session, that, you know, maybe after week 1 or after 5 days, I can go in on the back end and say, you know, we have 10 applications, most are these types of people, and we can kind of rethink our strategy for outreach and how we might want to continue to push it or what not.
Yeah, I still feel that way, because I think the beauty of this Google form is that we can also just look at the identifying demographics, and we can say, gosh, we've got a ton of men who've applied for this committee and very few women, or we have no parents at all who've applied, or gosh, we sent it out to all the academics we know, but we have no one from institutions of higher education. We've got to double down our efforts to get applicants from there without reading the content.
Yeah. And also, you know, if it does seem like, you know, we don't have enough applications around, you know, June 10th, June 11th, we can make that decision, I feel like, at that point to say, let's extend this a week, and maybe the turnaround time for review of those applications is shortened.
Yeah, I think that all makes really good sense. So Ruth, I appreciate the concern, because I think it's a reasonable one, and hopefully we can mitigate it. And then if not, you know, the beauty of this is that we're designing this process. The scary part of this is we're designing this process, but we can redesign it as we need to. It does make me really anxious, but we can.
It's fine with me. Sounds good.
Great. Thank you all for your time. The next thing you'll get from me is this Excel-like Google spreadsheet of all the people we think need to receive this application, so that you can tell me who I have missed. I will also make the syllabus editable so that you all can add additional thoughts, questions, comments in there. And I'll see most of you at the research committee meeting this afternoon.
Yes.
In just 1.5. See you soon.
Bye.
You know.